The courtroom fell eerily quiet as the little figure of 5-year-old Lily Thompson walked in, her tiny hand tightly gripping the leash of Max, a scarred German shepherd whose sharp, alert eyes scanned the room with military precision. Lily's silence seemed to envelop the entire courtroom, but her presence carried a weight that spoke louder than words ever could. Judge Carter leaned forward in his chair, his usually stern demeanor softening as he watched the child, who, despite being small and fragile, could potentially condemn a monster. If only she could find her voice. But Lily had been mute ever since the traumatic incident 2 weeks ago. Across the room, the defendant sat with a smirk on his face. Richard Collins, the man accused of attempting to abduct Lily, seemed confident. His lawyer had carefully crafted a defense based on the trauma of a silent child, convinced that the child's inability to speak would pose no threat to his client's freedom. He saw Lily as nothing more than a frightened child, her silence a shield that would leave the court with nothing to hold him accountable. But then something shifted. As Lily's eyes locked onto Collins across the room, her small fingers trembled, forming a subtle gesture, a signal so slight that only two beings in the courtroom took notice, the judge and the dog. Max's reaction was immediate and electric. His powerful body tensed, ears shooting forward, a low growl rising from his chest. His gaze never left the defendant, and it was enough to rattle the courtroom. The murmur in the gallery was silenced by the crack of the judge's gavel, a sharp sound that echoed through the room. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," Judge Carter announced, his voice laced with urgency. A wave of whispers rippled through the spectators as the courtroom emptied for a brief break, but everyone knew the gravity of what had just happened. Something was shifting in the air, and it wasn't just the silent child. Lily had been the heart of the Thompson family until 17 days ago. She had once been a chatterbox, her copper curls framing a face full of innocent joy. But now at 5 years old, she carried the heavy silence of selective mutism, her voice locked away after a traumatic event that had nearly cost her everything. Sarah and Michael Thompson, Lily's parents, watched helplessly as their daughter retreated further into herself. She flinched at strangers and awoke each night, screaming from nightmares. Lily had changed in ways they could hardly comprehend, and they were unable to help her find her way back. Their therapist had suggested something radical, a therapy dog. It was an unconventional idea, but the Thompsons were desperate. Max was not always a therapy dog. The imposing German shepherd had a past that had molded him into something extraordinary. He had served in tactical K-9 units, his powerful frame and keen intelligence making him an exceptional police dog. But Max's scars, both visible and invisible, told a story of devotion, betrayal, and survival. 3 years ago, during a pursuit, Max had taken a knife meant for his handler, Officer James Martinez. The department, facing budget cuts, couldn't afford the expensive medical bills for his recovery and rehabilitation. Max was scheduled for euthanasia, but then Dr. Jennifer Reynolds, an animal-assisted therapy specialist, had intervened just hours before Max's scheduled death. She saw something in his intelligent eyes that spoke of a deeper connection. Through months of rehabilitation, Max had emerged not just healed, but transformed. Trained to detect and respond to emotional distress in children, Max had found a new purpose, one that would lead him to Lily. The first time Max met Lily, she was hiding behind her mother's legs, too frightened to move. Max, ever the professional, kept his distance. For 20 minutes, neither of them moved. Then, without prompting, Lily had taken a few hesitant steps toward the dog, extending her small hand. Max lowered his massive head, his breath warm against her palm. It was as if something passed between them, a shared understanding, a connection born of silent recognition. Over the course of their therapy sessions, Max and Lily had developed a subtle language, a series of hand gestures and gentle touches that allowed them to communicate without words. Though Lily still wouldn't speak, she began to draw again, pictures of a small girl and a large dog standing together, their silhouettes outlined against dark, shadowy figures. The Thompsons had begun to hope that Max might be the key to unlocking their daughter's voice. Little did they know, the trial would prove to be a far greater challenge than they ever anticipated. As the trial date approached, the Thompsons had no idea how much Max would change the course of everything. They could never have foreseen how their daughter's silence would become a weapon, how the bond between a traumatized child and a loyal dog would reveal something darker and far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. The morning of April 15th had begun like any other spring day in the Thompson household. Unremarkable, peaceful even. The sun filtered through the windows, casting long, golden beams on the porch where Sarah Thompson stood, watching her daughter chase butterflies among the daffodils in the backyard. The air was crisp, the kind of day that promised the sweetness of summer, with the smell of fresh grass and the sound of children's laughter hanging in the air. Sarah's heart ached as she watched Lily run freely, her joy so evident, so pure, before the shadows of what had happened to her began to cast their darkness. It had been a typical Wednesday. Sarah had gotten off early from her teaching job at Jefferson Elementary, and Michael, Lily's father, would be home by 6. They had planned a simple barbecue in the backyard, but as Sarah stepped inside to take a phone call from her sister, everything changed. The phone call had lasted only 4 minutes, but when Sarah returned, something was wrong. The gate to the backyard was ajar, and Lily, her little girl, was talking to a man beside a black van parked just outside their quiet suburban street. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The picture in her mind was clear as she rushed toward the yard, calling Lily's name sharply. The man's head snapped up, his expression shifting from friendly and affable to something darker, something calculating. In an instant, he reached for Lily's arm. The words he spoke were simple, but they chilled Sarah's bones. "I have puppies in my van, special puppies, puppies that need a little girl to take care of them. Don't you want to see them?" Sarah's voice rang out in a sharp command, but Lily had already been taken. The terrifying moment was interrupted by a voice. Eleanor Wires, a 74-year-old retired nurse who was walking her terrier across the street. Eleanor screamed. The man hesitated for just a split second, then, in a flash, released Lily and darted into his van, speeding away so quickly that the tires left black marks on the pavement. Eleanor's quick thinking saved Lily. She had memorized the first 4 digits of the van's license plate, a detail that would prove critical later on. When Detective Robert Anderson arrived 20 minutes later, he took in the scene with a grim expression. Though their quiet neighborhood had never seemed a likely target for such heinous crimes, Anderson knew better. There was a pattern. This was the 5th time a child had been approached with the same deceptive story. Puppies in a van, only to disappear without a trace. The first 4 children were gone. No one had ever seen them again. "This might be our break," Anderson had told the Thompsons, his voice grave. The evidence had been circumstantial, but the partial plate numbers Eleanor had provided might just be enough to track down the man who had attempted to abduct Lily. The investigation moved quickly. Traffic cameras caught sight of the black van heading east. When they cross-referenced the partial license plate number with vehicle records, it led them to a man named Richard Collins, 45 years old, a computer technician with no criminal record. A search of his modest ranch house turned up nothing that could directly link him to any crimes, but a forensic team found something troubling in his garage: dog hair from multiple breeds and a freshly bleached concrete floor. Collins owned no dogs. The pieces didn't fit. Confronted with this evidence, Collins maintained his innocence. He claimed he was simply helping a friend transport rescue dogs. But when investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a hidden external hard drive in Collins' home. The contents were chilling. Photographs of missing children, children who matched the descriptions of those who had disappeared over the last 18 months. It was enough to arrest him. However, despite the hard drive evidence, no bodies had been found, and Collins refused to disclose their location. Without recovered victims, the case against him was circumstantial, and the prosecution's hopes rested heavily on one piece of key testimony: Lily's. The problem was, Lily hadn't spoken a word since the attempted abduction. The Thompsons' child, traumatized by the events of that day, had retreated into silence. Her selective mutism, triggered by the trauma, made her unable to speak. And so, her silence became the prosecution's greatest challenge. District Attorney Diana Peterson met with the Thompsons in her office, a room adorned with photographs of children, some smiling, some serious, and some courtroom sketches of tragic cases. "We need Lily's account," Peterson said gently. "She's our only eyewitness to directly interact with Collins during the abduction attempt. But I know how difficult this will be. I understand her condition. Michael Thompson ran a hand through his hair. He looked exhausted, as though every ounce of energy had been drained from him. She hasn't spoken a word since it happened. The therapist said it's selective mutism, brought on by trauma. We can't force her to relive that moment. I understand, Peterson said, her tone softening, but there is a relatively new program that allows therapy animals in courtrooms for child witnesses. The presence of a trained animal can reduce anxiety and help children communicate, even when they can't speak. The Thompsons were unsure, but they were desperate. They agreed to meet with Dr. Jennifer Reynolds, the same specialist who had helped Max through his rehabilitation after his injury. When Lily met Max for the first time, the connection was instant. Dr. Reynolds had arranged a mock courtroom setup in her office, a small child-sized chair in the witness stand for Lily to sit in, with Max sitting quietly beside her. At first, Lily remained frozen, her small fingers twisting the hem of her dress in anxiety. But then Dr. Reynolds showed Lily how to communicate with Max using simple hand signals. If you feel scared, Lily, Dr. Reynolds explained, demonstrating the gesture, you can signal Max like this. He'll come to you and be there for you. To everyone's surprise, Lily mimicked the gesture perfectly. Max, ever the professional, immediately moved toward her, his large head lowering in greeting, his breath warm against her palm. For the first time since the incident, Lily's face relaxed. Her fingers buried themselves in Max's thick fur, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It was a breakthrough. From that day on, Lily practiced sitting in the witness stand with Max by her side. She wouldn't speak, but she could shake her head or nod in response to questions. She could communicate with gestures. The prosecution believed it might be enough if Lily could confirm or deny key details with her subtle signals. The day of the trial arrived, and Lily sat quietly beside her parents as they entered the courtroom. The atmosphere was thick with tension, with news vans lining the streets outside and cameras focused on the young girl who had the power to change the fate of a man accused of unspeakable crimes. The courtroom was packed. Legal experts, advocates, reporters, everyone was waiting to see how the state's legal system would handle this unprecedented case. For the first time in history, a therapy animal was going to accompany a child witness. When Richard Collins's defense attorney, Thomas Wilson, filed a motion to exclude Max from the courtroom, the stakes couldn't have been higher. He argued that Max, a large German shepherd, would be prejudicial to the jury, that the presence of a dog would skew their judgment. But Diana Peterson, the district attorney, fought back, presenting affidavits from child psychologists and other jurisdictions where therapy animals had been successfully used. Judge William Carter, known for his strict adherence to legal procedures, listened carefully. He had been disqualified from cases involving missing children after his own daughter had disappeared years earlier. The case struck close to home, and his decision was going to be one of the most important of his career. After a brief recess, Judge Carter returned to deliver his ruling. Max would be allowed to stay, but with conditions. The dog would remain in the witness box, separate from the jury, and the jury would be instructed not to let Max's presence influence their judgment. Wilson objected, but the ruling stood. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Some jurors couldn't help but smile at the sight of the dog and child together, while others maintained careful neutrality. But what no one anticipated was how dramatically Lily's presence and Max's would impact the trial. As the trial continued, the bond between Lily and Max became central to the case. The courtroom watched in awe as Max's presence allowed Lily to testify, to find her voice through silent gestures and subtle movements. No one knew how far this connection would go, or how it would ultimately lead to a revelation that would change everything. The trial was reaching its critical moments. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, and every witness, every piece of evidence, every gesture from Lily seemed to carry an enormous weight. By the third day of the trial, Richard Collins's defense was beginning to crumble. His lawyer, Thomas Wilson, had done his best to undermine Lily's testimony, questioning her competency and suggesting that her gestures could be influenced or coached, but the child remained steadfast. Every time she pointed to the defendant or shook her head in response to the questions, it was clear Lily was communicating the truth in the only way she could. Then something happened that no one could have anticipated. Max's attention was drawn towards something in the courtroom. a shift in his behavior that went unnoticed by everyone except for the observant. The German Shepherd's body stiffened. His eyes locked on Collins with unmistakable recognition. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, but it wasn't just aggression, it was an alert, a reaction that had been ingrained in him during his years of police service. Officer James Martinez, who had once worked with Max, noticed the reaction immediately. He had seen Max display this behavior before, when the dog was responding to someone he had encountered during a high-stress situation. In a hushed voice, Martinez leaned over to the prosecutor, Diana Peterson. "That's not just a random reaction," he whispered. "He's recognizing him. He remembers him." The court held its collective breath as the prosecution requested a brief recess to investigate the dog's reaction. It was a stunning moment. Was it possible that Max knew something more than anyone had expected? During the recess, Detective Anderson reviewed the case files and realized the connection that had remained hidden for years. 3 years earlier, during a child endangerment case, Max had been severely injured while pursuing a suspect, a man who had stabbed him before escaping. That suspect, it turned out, had been Richard Collins. The pieces started to fall into place. Collins had been the man who had injured Max. And now, seeing him in the courtroom, Max was reacting not out of aggression, but out of recognition. It was as though the dog's finely tuned senses were piecing together a puzzle that human investigators had missed. The realization was earth-shattering. Collins wasn't just the man who had tried to abduct Lily. He had been connected to a series of other disappearances. And now, thanks to Max's alert, the investigation was about to take a turn toward uncovering something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The case against Collins had already been strong, but this new development was enough to push the trial into overdrive. The jury's focus shifted as they learned of the hidden connection between Max and Collins, and the revelations continued to pile up. When Collins's ex-wife, Margaret Collins, took the stand, she provided a chilling account of her time with the defendant. She had discovered disturbing photographs and a collection of children's collars hidden in their home. She had left him after realizing the depths of his obsession with children, a fact that added another layer of horror to the case. As the testimony continued, the defense lawyer, Thomas Wilson, attempted to argue that Collins's xenophobia, the fear of dogs, was the reason Max should be excluded from the trial. But this argument faltered when Dr. Jennifer Reynolds, who had trained Max, explained that the dog was hypoallergenic. Moreover, the supposed phobia didn't align with Collins's actions, using puppies as a lure for children in his abductions. The contradictions were too glaring to ignore. The pressure mounted as the court moved forward, and the true scale of Collins' crimes became evident. But the most stunning moment of the trial came when Lily, drawing once again in the courtroom, depicted a hidden room on Collins' property. The image she had created, a place she had never seen, led the investigators to a concealed underground space where they found more evidence: photographs, journals, and the tragic remnants of Collins's other victims. Then, the moment that would forever define the case arrived.